His tutor had a specific phrase for him: not slow, not behind, not the polite Victorian euphemism for a boy who couldn't keep up. John Neale Dalton, appointed royal tutor in 1871, reportedly described Prince Albert Victor's mind as being in the abnormally dormant condition. 7 words, and they followed this man for the rest of his short life, cited in biographies, repeated in histories, used to explain away everything from his academic failures to his erratic social behaviour to, eventually, the official silence surrounding his death. Albert Victor Christian Edward, Eddy to everyone who knew him, was born on the 8th of January 1864 at Frogmore House, Windsor, at 8:58 in the evening, 2 months before his mother expected him. He weighed under 4 pounds. Princess Alexandra of Denmark had been carrying him since the spring. He arrived in winter, unannounced and underprepared. Queen Victoria came to inspect this new heir to the most powerful throne on earth and described what she found as a mere little red lump. Victorian medicine in 1864 had no word for what had happened and no framework for what it might mean. There were no neonatal wards, no incubators, no clinical understanding of what those final 8 weeks of gestation accomplish in a developing human brain. The myelin sheath wrapping itself around neural pathways, the systems governing auditory processing and language acquisition completing their wiring in the protected environment of the womb. A wet nurse. A prayer. The expectation that nature would deliver its verdict without medical assistance. He survived. Grew, eventually, into a tall young man with the dark coloring of his Danish mother rather than the heavy Hanoverian features of his father's family. Long-necked, full-lipped, described in every surviving account as striking rather than conventionally handsome. His mother Alexandra already had documented partial deafness. Sir Henry Ponsonby, Victoria's private secretary, noted privately that Albert Victor might have inherited it. Whether auditory processing difficulties compounded whatever else the premature birth had disrupted doesn't appear to have been a question anyone with authority over his education thought to ask. Alexandra loved all 5 of her surviving children without boundary and showed it. She called them by childish nicknames well into their adulthood, held them close, treated them as extensions of herself rather than as people developing separately from her. Albert Victor's father, Edward, Prince of Wales, had significantly less patience for a son who seemed perpetually elsewhere. His grandmother Victoria wrote of him with the particular opacity of a woman who had concerns she couldn't name clearly, describing him as not at all something, the sentence surviving in George V's biography without its completing thought. The institutions surrounding Eddy assessed him through one lens from the beginning: whether he would make an adequate king. By that measure, he failed early and consistently. By other measures, warmth, the capacity to make people feel genuinely seen, the good nature described by every contemporary who liked him, the record suggests he succeeded in ways the institution never adequately documented, because those qualities didn't appear on the official ledger of kingly fitness. Andrew Cook, whose 2006 biography remains the most thorough modern scholarly treatment, argues that Albert Victor was as popular and charismatic a figure in his own time as Princess Diana a century later. As in her case, his sudden death in 1892 resulted in public demonstrations of grief on a scale rarely seen at the time. Shops closed across Britain. Bells tolled. Alexandra preserved his room at Sandringham exactly as it was when he left it. Hairbrushes on the dresser, shaving things laid out. A fire kept burning in the grate for years afterward, as if keeping the room warm was the same as keeping him present. His father kept Eddy's photograph above his bed until Edward VII died in 1910. Between 1879 and 1882, Albert Victor circumnavigated the globe aboard HMS Bacanti. The Americas, the Falkland Islands, South Africa, Australia, Fiji, Japan, Singapore, Ceylon, Egypt, the Holy Land, Greece. He and his brother George received tattoos in Japan. Back in England, he loved polo, hated drilling. In October 1886, he watched Burnley play Bolton Wanderers at Turf Moor, the first royal to attend a professional football ground, and Burnley received a set of kits bearing the royal coat of arms to mark the occasion. He opened the Hammersmith Suspension Bridge in June 1887. On the 1st of December 1891, at Luton Hoo, the country residence of the Danish ambassador, Albert Victor proposed to Princess Victoria Mary of Teck. She accepted. The wedding was planned for February 27, 1892. He died 6 weeks after the engagement, 6 weeks before the ceremony, at 28 years and 6 days old. That is the biography the institution was comfortable leaving intact. 3 other threads, about his mind, his sexuality, and his alleged connection to the most notorious unsolved murders in British history, received different treatment entirely. Being born 2 months premature in 1864 produced developmental consequences that Victorian medicine had no language to describe, let alone address. The royal household applied what it had always applied: a single tutor, a shared curriculum, and a brother to keep pace with. Prince George arrived 17 months after Albert Victor and was placed under Dalton's instruction alongside the heir presumptive. Same lessons, same pace, same expectations. George thrived. Albert Victor didn't, and the interpretation placed on that failure was that he lacked the mental capacity his position required, not that the educational framework was structurally misaligned with how his mind actually worked. Dalton's assessment survives through Andrew Cook's biography, The Abnormally Dormant Condition of the Prince's Mind. But Dalton followed it with a second observation that tells a considerably more complicated story. Prince Albert Victor requires the stimulus of Prince George's company to induce him to work it all. Separating the brothers had been proposed and discussed. Dalton advised against it. The practical reason was that without his younger brother present, the heir to the British throne simply stopped engaging with structured instruction. What Dalton called dormancy was specifically responsive to social and interpersonal stimulus, a mind that organizes itself around engagement rather than individual performance, that needs connection to activate, isn't dormant in any neurologically meaningful sense. It's differently wired. The distinction didn't exist in Victorian educational theory. His instructors recorded a detail that cuts through everything else. Albert Victor learnt best by listening rather than reading or writing, and had no difficulty retaining information when material was delivered that way. Present him with a book, and he struggled. Present him with a room full of interesting people and conversation, and the retention was strong. That isn't a description of dormancy. It describes a processing profile that the standard Victorian curriculum, built around reading, writing, and individual examination performance, was entirely unsuited to accommodate. His time at Trinity College, Cambridge, from 1883, was arranged for him by an institution that had run out of alternatives, and it turned out to be, according to Andrew Cook's research, among the happiest of his life. The tutor assigned was James Kenneth Stephen, a poet and academic in his mid-20s, educated at Eton and King's College, several years older than Eddy but close enough in age to relate to him differently than any previous instructor had. Stephen was initially optimistic about the prince, coming to see that he was far from stupid and that his fine human qualities of kindness and empathy for others were strong foundations for a successful constitutional monarch. He worked through literature and poetry, through the intellectual social life of Cambridge, rather than through examination preparation. Freed from the claustrophobic royal cocoon, Albert Victor began to blossom. By the time the party was due to move to Cambridge, though, Stephen had concluded that the prince could derive little benefit from attending lectures there, that he barely knew the meaning of the words to read. After working with Albert Victor through that Cambridge year, his position appears to have moderated considerably. The revision, whatever form it took, left no trace in the accessible institutional record. Stephen's own mental health deteriorated in subsequent years. He suffered from a documented psychiatric illness that affected his reliability as both an instructor and a witness to Albert Victor's capabilities. He died in 1892, having reportedly stopped eating after Eddy's death. The institution that might have noted this, that the young man's former tutor starved himself in grief, left it unrecorded in any surviving document the public can access. Albert Victor was excused from formal examinations at Cambridge and awarded an honorary degree. Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, still called him an inveterate and incurable dawdler. Princess Augusta dismissed him in French as si peu de choses, such a small thing. His mother attributed the lethargy to having grown too tall too fast. No one who held institutional authority over him appears to have asked whether a child born 2 months premature might have needed something other than the educational structure designed for an uncompromised, full-term development. The question would have required the institution to acknowledge that its heir had a condition it had no capacity to address. Calling him dormant was simpler. The original document containing those words, whatever letter or report they were written in, on whatever date, hasn't been located in any accessible archive. On July 4, 1889, a routine theft investigation at the General Post Office found a 15-year-old telegraph boy named Charles Swinskow carrying 18 shillings, more than 1.5 times his weekly wage. Under questioning, Swinskow admitted he had earned the money performing sexual acts at a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street in Fitzrovia. Within days, the investigation had identified multiple post office employees who were moonlighting at the same address. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline obtained warrants and raided 19 Cleveland Street on the 6th of July. Aberline had spent the previous autumn leading the Metropolitan Police's investigation into the Whitechapel murders. He wasn't a man easily surprised by what London kept in its shadow world. Cleveland Street surprised him anyway. Among those identified by brothel workers was Lord Arthur Somerset, third son of the 8th Duke of Beaufort, superintendent of the stables to the Prince of Wales, a man whose professional life brought him into regular contact with the household of the heir presumptive. Multiple workers named Somerset directly and specifically. His connection to the case was documented, not rumored. Albert Victor's name entered the investigation through an entirely separate mechanism. It appeared in none of the evidence gathered from the brothel workers. It entered circulation as a legal weapon, deployed by Somerset's solicitor Arthur Newton, as a tactic to raise the political cost of prosecution above the threshold that prosecutors were willing to pay. Newton threatened, in effect, to implicate the Prince of Wales's eldest son, a move designed to make the Cleveland Street case untouchable, rather than to produce evidence of Albert Victor's involvement. Because there was no such evidence to produce. Letters subsequently exchanged between Treasury Solicitor Sir Augustus Stevenson and his assistant, Hamilton Cuff, reference Newton's threat, carefully, obliquely, in phrasing the Wikipedia entry on Albert Victor describes as coded. These men understood precisely what was being managed. They committed just enough to paper to show it was being managed, and not enough to specify through what mechanism or on whose instruction. Somerset himself, writing privately to his friend Lord Esher from France after his departure, captured the ambiguity with inadvertent precision. I can quite understand the Prince of Wales being much annoyed at his son's name being coupled with the thing, but that was the case before I left it. We were both accused of going to this place, but not together. I wonder if it's really a fact or only an invention of that arch-ruffian Hammond." He continued, "I have never mentioned the boy's name except to Probyn, Montague, and Knollys when they were acting for me, and I thought they ought to know." Somerset's own letter, written by a man whose documented involvement in the scandal was the most concrete fact in the entire case, reveals that even he was uncertain whether Albert Victor had ever visited the brothel, or whether Hammond, the proprietor, had fabricated the association. He was wondering, from France, whether the rumor his solicitor had weaponized was even true. On the 7th of August, 1889, Albert Victor was interviewed by Metropolitan Police officers regarding the Cleveland Street matter. The record of that interview hasn't survived. The prosecution then collapsed in the specific way these things collapse when proximity to power is involved. The case against Hammond was quietly dropped. Somerset received his terms: generous allowance, permanent French exile, silence in exchange for both, and departed English jurisdiction for the final 37 years of his life. Ernest Park, editor of the North London Press, published his account of the scandal on the 16th of November, 1889. He was convicted of criminal libel on the 16th of January, 1890, and sentenced to 12 months in prison. Popular accounts almost uniformly state that Park was jailed for exposing the prince. He wasn't. Park's conviction was specifically for naming Henry Fitzroy, Earl of Euston, a separate aristocrat connected to the affair. Albert Victor's name never appeared in Park's article. The entire English press had collectively, silently, chosen not to print it. Welsh-language newspapers, colonial papers, and American publications were less restrained. The New York Times described Albert Victor as a dullard and a stupid, perverse boy who would never be allowed to ascend the British throne. In England itself, on the specific question of the prince's involvement, nothing. Henry Labouchere, author of the 1885 amendment criminalizing homosexual acts, a career parliamentary irritant to the establishment, stood in the House of Commons on February 28, 1890, and publicly accused the government of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice in its handling of the Cleveland Street prosecutions. That accusation is preserved in Hansard because Parliament was the one institution the Victorian establishment couldn't sanitize after the fact. It's the most explicit primary source statement available that the suppression of the Cleveland Street case was deliberate policy rather than administrative discretion. Newton, whose legal threats had circulated Albert Victor's name without authenticated evidence, was later convicted of obstructing justice in connection with the Cleveland Street matter and sentenced to 6 weeks in prison. 60 years later, in the 1950s, Harold Nicholson, writing the official biography of George V, was told by Lord Goddard that Albert Victor had been involved in a male brothel scene and that a solicitor had to commit perjury to clear him. None of the lawyers in the Cleveland Street case were convicted of perjury during the scandal. Newton's later criminal conduct came in an entirely unrelated matter, but Goddard's account, 6 decades old, filtered through elite private memory, illustrates what sustained institutional suppression actually produces. A story that persists in whispers among those who were there, impossible to verify, impossible to formally deny, traveling intact from drawing room to drawing room across generations, while the official record holds its silence. Documents from 1885 and 1886 confirm Albert Victor was taking medicine for gonorrhea, most likely contracted from female prostitutes. Historian H. Montgomery Hyde concluded, "There is no evidence that he was homosexual or even bisexual." Somerset's sister, Lady Waterford, wrote of Eddy that she was "sure the boy is as straight as a line." Others, examining the Cambridge years and Stephen's apparent emotional attachment, looking at the pattern of behaviour his father found alarming enough to arrange a 7-month Indian tour the moment the Cleveland Street gossip reached its peak, reach different conclusions. The institution chose neither answer. It chose silence. And silence produced exactly what the institution needed, a question that could never be decisively resolved in either direction. Between 31st of August and 9th of November 1888, 5 women were murdered in the Whitechapel district of East London. Mary Ann Nichols on 31st of August, Annie Chapman on 8th September, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on 30th September. The double event, 2 women in a single night. Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th. The case was never solved. Into the vacuum, more than 130 years of theory have poured. Albert Victor's name first appeared as a Ripper suspect in a 1962 biography of Edward VII by the French writer Philippe Julian. No significant public sensation followed. The explosion came in 1970, when a retired surgeon named Thomas Stowell published an article titled "Jack the Ripper, a Solution?" in The Criminologist. Stowell described an unnamed aristocrat driven to murderous insanity by syphilis, whose crimes had been subsequently covered up by the British establishment. He never named Albert Victor directly. Fleet Street and its readers filled in the obvious gap within days. On November 5, 1970, Stowell wrote to the Times denying he had ever intended to imply Prince Albert Victor was the Ripper. The Times published the letter on November 9th. Stowell died on November 8th, one day before his retraction appeared in print. His theory survived him by decades. Stephen Knight's 1976 book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, established the royal conspiracy theory in popular culture, and Knight's specific argument is almost always misrepresented. He didn't claim Albert Victor committed the murders. He claimed Albert Victor was the person being protected, that the prince had secretly and illegally married a working-class Catholic woman named Annie Elizabeth Crook, that she had borne him a child, and that the murders were then committed by Sir William Gull, surgeon in ordinary to Queen Victoria, the same physician who had treated Albert Victor himself for typhoid at HMS Britannia in 1877. Aided by a coachman named John Netley to silence women who knew about the illegal marriage. The doctor who saved the future king's life at 13, in Knight's version, spent 1888 killing women on the king's behalf. Knight's primary source for this entire construction was Joseph Gorman, also known as Joseph Sickert, who claimed descent from Albert Victor and Annie Crook through the painter Walter Sickert. Gorman gave Knight detailed accounts of the conspiracy over years of research. Knight built his book around them. Gorman later publicly retracted his story and admitted to the press that it was a hoax. Melvin Fairclough published The Ripper and the Royals in 1991, extending Knight's thesis using extracts from an allegedly discovered investigator's diary. Fairclough eventually acknowledged he no longer believes his own theory. The alibi evidence is the simplest part. On September 30th, 1888, the night Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both murdered in London, Albert Victor was at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. His presence there is confirmed by the official court circular, family journals, letters, and contemporary newspaper reports. He had documented alibis for multiple murders in the series. Ripperologists Paul Begg, Martin Fido, and Keith Skinner concluded in their authoritative reference work that no historical evidence in support of this theory has ever been adduced, and described the impossibility of Albert Victor actually being the killer. He was in Scotland. The primary source for the theory admitted it was fabricated. The follow-up researcher withdrew his own conclusions. The theory persists because the vacuum it fills is real, even when the theory isn't. Aberline worked the Whitechapel murders in autumn 1888. 9 months later, he led the Cleveland Street raid and watched a prosecution of aristocratic clients dissolve around him in ways he could neither fully document nor explain through official channels. The Prince of Wales' son was interviewed, and the record disappeared. Sir Charles Warren, Metropolitan Police Commissioner during the Ripper investigation of 1888, was a documented Freemason, his Masonic signature preserved in archival collections held by the Jack the Ripper official tour. Warren resigned as commissioner in November 1888 during the investigation, following a dispute with the Home Secretary, whose full terms aren't recorded with the clarity history would prefer. Night-specific Masonic conspiracy theory collapsed when Gorman admitted the hoax. The more general observation, that Victorian policing operated within networks of class loyalty that systematically protected aristocratic clients from the legal consequences of their behaviour, isn't a conspiracy theory. It's what the Cleveland Street case demonstrated in documented form through coded Treasury solicitor letters, a purchased exile, a dropped prosecution, and a missing interview record. 3 scandals. 3 times the institution produced the same response: managed silence, documentary absence, and a replacement narrative that could be neither fully confirmed nor fully disproved. The Cleveland Street prosecution was dismantled through political pressure documented in coded correspondence rather than explicit orders. Somerset's silence was purchased at public expense for 37 years of continental exile. The journalist who reported the scandal served time in prison for the wrong conviction. The police interview of the heir presumptive simply ceased to exist as a legible record. Labouchere made his accusation from the floor of Parliament, the one forum with a guaranteed permanent transcript, because everywhere else the accusation would disappear. The allegation of neurodivergence was resolved by the institution declining to investigate it as anything other than laziness. No physician was asked to examine whether premature birth had produced developmental consequences. No educational specialist was consulted. The heir's struggles were attributed to dormancy and uninspiring instruction, explanations that located the problem entirely within the boy and required nothing to be adjusted in the structures surrounding him. The Ripper connection was, of the 3, the most straightforward to contain. The alibi was real, the theorists eventually discredited themselves publicly, and there was nothing to suppress because the connection was invented. But the theory proved impossible to kill, because everything else around Albert Victor had been handled in ways that left unanswerable questions. When the institutional response to every other question about a man has been silence and record disappearance, a fabricated theory about murder fills the resulting vacuum with remarkable ease. The institution didn't create the Ripper myth. The institution created the conditions in which the myth could grow indefinitely, without meeting a complete public record that might refute it. What the institution never produced, not during Albert Victor's life, not after his death, was a clear and full account of anything. Queen Victoria received the news of her grandson's death in stages, each telegram worse than the last. The first, that morning, from Dr. Broadbent to Dr. Reed. Improvement continued till 2, when collapse affecting chiefly respiration, with complete unconsciousness, came on. There has been a rally, but condition extremely grave. Then, at 7:20 in the morning, there have been fluctuations since telegraphing at 4, but patient now sinking. Then, while she was dressing, her daughter Helena came in with a final telegram from the Prince of Wales. Our darling Eddy has been taken from us. We are broken-hearted. Victoria wrote in her journal, "Words are too poor to express one's feelings of grief, horror, and distress. Poor, poor parents. Poor May. To have her whole bright future to be merely a dream. Poor me, in my old age, to see this young, promising life cut short. I, who loved him so dearly, and to whom he was so devoted." He had caught influenza while shooting at Sandringham in early January, during the pandemic killing thousands across Britain that winter, and deteriorated over a week. Alexandra sat with him through it. George sat with him. Princess Mary of Teck, 6 weeks engaged, sat with the family through the vigil. 3 physicians attended and concurred. Influenza complicated by pneumonia. His father, the Prince of Wales, wrote to Victoria afterward, "To lose our eldest son is one of those calamities one can never really get over." He added, "I would have given my life for his, as I put no value on mine." Edward wept throughout the funeral on January 20th, 1892. The same man who had mocked Eddy's apathy, worried endlessly about his dissipations, and arranged his 7-month Indian tour to remove him from London gossip at precisely the moment the Cleveland Street scandal required someone to be removed. Whether the grief was for the son, for the problems the son had caused, or for the question of what those problems had actually been and whether they could ever have been properly addressed, the record does not say. Edward, Prince of Wales, wept at his son's funeral and left no written account of what was passing through his mind at the time. Alexandra never recovered. She kept the room at Sandringham as she had found it on the morning of the 7th of January, when Eddy had gone out shooting and caught his death. The fire burning, the brushes on the dresser, the shaving things waiting. She kept it that way for decades. Albert Victor's tomb sits in the Albert Memorial Chapel at Windsor, to the rear of the main church, separate from most of the family he served and was constrained by and mourned by and, finally, outlived by everyone. Few tourists who walk past it know who he was. Princess Mary of Teck eventually became engaged to Albert Victor's surviving brother George, and she became Queen Mary, controlled, unsmiling, utterly devoted to an institution that had designed her to steady one heir, and then, when that heir was gone, required her to steady the institution itself for 4 more decades. The wedding planned for the 27th of February 1892 never took place. She never wore the dress. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, gave a television interview to BBC Newsnight in November 2019, in which he attempted to explain his long association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The interview produced the phrases "no sweat" and "Pizza Express in Woking" as public shorthand for what catastrophic institutional miscalculation sounds like. Within 10 days, Andrew announced he was stepping back from royal duties. Buckingham Palace issued statements over subsequent years, first defending him, then distancing from him, then repositioning the institution's relationship to him as the public pressure compounded. In February 2022, Andrew settled the civil lawsuit brought against him by Virginia Giuffre. The terms weren't disclosed. The settlement prevented a trial, which meant it prevented the full evidentiary discovery a trial would have required from entering the public record. No complete testimony. No formal judicial finding. Early in 2022, his military titles and royal patronages were formally returned to the Queen, and he ceased using the HRH style in official contexts. The structural parallel to the Cleveland Street mechanism isn't procedurally identical. Different legal system, different century, different media environment. But the function is recognizable. Somerset's French exile purchased silence by preventing a trial. Andrew's civil settlement prevented a trial. The institution in both cases managed toward an outcome where no full evidentiary record entered the public domain. The individual was separated from the institution, and the institution continued. The Victorian version ran on a gentleman's allowance and a permanent departure. The modern version ran on legal procedure and institutional severance. The result was the same: managed opacity, not accountability, with the institution intact on the other side of it. The playbook doesn't require Victorian conditions to run. It requires an institution with sufficient resources, sufficient legal sophistication, and sufficient interest in its own survival to ensure that complete records don't accumulate. Those conditions have remained fairly consistent. Albert Victor died at 28, premature from birth in a medical environment with no framework for what that meant, struggling through an educational system designed around a processing style he didn't share, rumored to have visited a brothel from which no witness ever directly named him, attributed with murders committed while he was 500 miles away, engaged to a woman who went on to marry his brother. His father became Edward VII, his brother became George V, his fiancée became Queen Mary. The institution flourished for another century and counting. Whatever he actually was, neurodivergent, bisexual, troubled, or simply a man caught between an enormous institutional expectation and a set of characteristics the institution had no interest in accommodating, the questions weren't answered. The police interview is gone. Dalton's original assessment survives only through secondary literature, its source document unlocated in any accessible archive. His private correspondence, to the extent it ever existed in substantial form, is inaccessible to researchers. The Royal Archives remain, in the judgment of multiple historians, firmly closed on the subject of the man who was supposed to be king. Andrew Cook called it airbrushing. The scrubbing wasn't clean enough to erase everything. Labouchere's parliamentary accusation survived. The Balmoral alibi survived. Somerset's own letter to Lord Esher survived in enough form to confirm that even the most directly implicated figure in the scandal wasn't certain what Albert Victor had or hadn't done. Enough remained to prove that something was being managed. Not enough remained to prove exactly what was being managed, which is precisely the position the institution needed the record to occupy. He was genuinely popular. He was genuinely mourned. He deserved better from the record than the institution left him, and the institution decided, clearly and repeatedly, that the record it left was sufficient. Subscribe for more stories like this.